It is the year of our Lord, 18th August, 1590. I, John White, Governor of Roanoke, sent by Walter Raleigh, under orders of Her Majesty, with the supplies desperately needed to prevent famine. Without God's mercy. I arrived only to find it empty. The war with Spain caused delays to the efforts, and I hoped the good people would have persevered. My journey back home was filled with terror, injury, a storm that derailed us, forcing men to pass from starvation and scurvy. My patron, Sir Walter Raleigh, pleaded with Her Majesty, only to be overruled. For years, I lingered, reaching out to anyone who could aid me, while my political rivals whispered against me. Fear for my loved ones and the colony plagued my nightmares, my waking moments, praying that I wouldn't be too late. Every night I looked at their portraits, wishing for none but the best possible fate. In 1588, I got 2 finishes, 2 small vessels, the Brave and the Roe, ships that were too small for warfare, and this blessing was soon stripped away. We were attacked by the devilish French pirates who had the indecency of striking me on the behind like I was some common cur. Our goods for the journey was seized, and fortunately, we were allowed to keep our lives. My return home to America by this point felt like a dream. For a time, I believed I was born under an unlucky star. Why would God be so unkind to me? Since 1588, I've strived to return home to gain the necessary supplies for the good of the colonists, but especially my family. Bad weather and privateering slowed our progress. However, God was on our side. We finally made it from the coast. The sight of the Virginian shoreline filled my heart with a renewed hope that I believed that I had lost. The crew and I let out cries of joy and victory. It wouldn't be long now. The joy turned into apprehension. In the ocean, we saw different fires, suggesting people had been there, yet when we arrived, they were gone. My desire was for people to show intense celebration, and only mist greeted us, left a lingering feeling we were no longer welcome. I could have sworn I saw some shadowy figures moving through, though perhaps it was naught but wishful thinking. We sang songs, hymns, and shanties they would recall, hoping they'd recognize them and feel safe enough to come out. When we landed, we found fresh tracks and footsteps in the sand. I couldn't tell who they were from. Some were shod, while others were barefoot. I couldn't tell if all were our people or not. No children among their number. Yet none answered us when we called out to them, telling them God was here to relieve them of their suffering, who we were, and why we had come. I expected to see people running back toward us, yet an eerie silence befell the land, and I had to silence whispers of ghosts among my men. Our journey toward the settlements brought confusion. The dirt pathway once frequently traveled had become overgrown, and we found no more footprints. It put a fearful spirit inside me. After muttering a silent prayer, we pushed onward and found CRO carved into a tree. I rested my hand on it, hoping to decipher when it was done, and there was no dried sap. It must have happened some time ago. We continued only to discover a defensive palisade had been built around the settlement. I knew there were tensions between the colony and the native population from where I was there, remembering the grim fate of George Howe, the previous governor, and the fate of the earlier colony that was left completely in ruins. I worried we'd find remnants of bones and signs of battle, images of butchered family members in my mind, my daughter's body cut to pieces, and Virginia's nothing but a bloody swaddle. My men hurried through to find their missing relatives, sent forward by desire, and called out their names, running through the empty settlement. I should have made them behave methodical. However, I am an artist rather than a military man. I too joined them with shouts of Virginia, the name of my granddaughter, and Eleanor, my daughter. No relieved calls answered me. It was an unkempt settlement with farming tools scattered over the floor. The fields had not been tiled for months at the very least. Only withered husks remained, and no signs of life were present. No animal nor human was found, with only the predatory ravens letting out cries of our arrival. They burst into flight in a terrifying omen of what was to come, finding my home and stopping sharply just outside. A raven slowly turns to gaze in my eyes, staring at me and taking flight. An old omen of death and change. The outside building had no signs of fire nor other damage. Immediately after, I ran to my house where we had lived and didn't find them there. I cared not for the state it was in, merely holding a desire to find them safe. Ananias! I called out the name of my son-in-law, desperate to see a familiar face of one who could aid me. Their house beside ours were equally abandoned, and no signs of an agonizing end. The crib where gentle Virginia would rest, yet it remained empty, having become a home for some manner of wildlife. Noticing other homes had been dismantled, pieces of thatch and support beams had been removed. I rested my hand on the remaining wood, vaguely remembering when the structure had been built long ago. I thought it would be permanent, and the reality of it passing was sinking in, suggested they had moved and found elsewhere to live. No living souls remained. No items of value were stolen from their rightful places. Well, except 3 of my chests that had been looted. The gold and valuables are now gone. My home was left in ruin and despair, yet I found no blood, nor bones. I found clothing inside of chests that had been abandoned, with any valuables having been stolen. Did the girls remember to take their treasures with them? Were they stolen, or could they use them to barter? The fabrics were coated in dust and carried flickers of black mold. Everything had been left to decay. My books torn from their covers, my paintings and maps destroyed with rain, and my armor consumed by rust. I stared at a painting of my family. The paint had run down, giving a ghastly appearance. The eyes of the subject dripped, disfiguring them, and I felt a fear run through me. I suspected a mutiny among them, or perhaps tension with the native peoples had blown to war in my absence. My men and I called out into the silence for our families, searching home after another, all to seek them out. I wished I had my wife, Thomason, with me to aid me. Her counsel was valuable, and she had a godly awareness that I lacked concerning different situations. I regretted following the communal decision and leaving them all behind to fend for themselves. Despite the need of our cause, I should have insisted that another would have been sent back to England. What would have happened if another had been sent instead? We didn't find any human nor animal remains that suggested they had starved or been riddled with plague nor famine, nor were there any mounds of dirt showing they had been cleared. A slow realization set among the search party that we wouldn't find them here. Wherever they had gone, it was a long time ago. All that remained was the discovery of any sign they'd left. I sought out the fence line and saw, carved into the wood, Croatoan, the name of one of the local tribes nearby, and thanked God when I didn't see the Maltese cross, the symbol we'd all agreed they would use if they were driven out through violence. Perhaps they had made their way there. That meant they could still be alive and have taken refuge among the Croatoan people. For a moment, God had granted me hope. All to be met with silence. Upon inspection of the storehouse, we found the remnants of grain that had been heavily rationed, but it was still there. Although now mostly rotten, with black mold filling it with a musky stink and worse, making it inedible. Fortunately, we had enough supply to keep us fed, and some of the boys could go out and hunt. I had to silence my men who whispered fearfully their weakness hopefully wouldn't turn to mutiny and cause them to turn. Idleness was an infection, so I put them to work as God intended, creating temporary shelter, though all of us were wary to be inside the buildings, and we made a camp in the town square. I could have sworn I saw shadowy images of people peering out through open doorways. The relative silence was unsettling. With nightfall descending, the warmth of a campfire offered a moment's reprieve, and with guards controlling the perimeter, we took a moment to rest, if you could call a sleepless night one. Famine and ill supply had always plagued the colony, even under the leadership of Governor Sir Ralph Lane. Either God was punishing us for some sin unknown to us, or placing us under a trial to be worthy of his love. I settled down to rest on my bedroll. Sleep evaded me, and I found myself restlessly rolling around. The idle chatter and drinking of the men served as a distraction. The campfire cracked, and yellow flames darted around. Perhaps staying inside the walls were a bad idea. Jack suggested perhaps ghosts will tell us what happened, only to be silenced by someone more superstitious. I hoped to return to the ship. The campfire crackled, their voices faded into obscurity, and soon I was without cause for alarm. I refused the offer of hardtack bread and gruel, too anxious to eat, and didn't want to upset my stomach. I was taunted with pictures of our oxen growing bony and sickly, the plump faces of the population growing gaunt, and I could sketch them from memory. I recognized all their faces, and instinctively I reached for my amulet, hidden under my shirt. I had an amulet made by Thomason when times were good. Pediach agang hovio quiscor amulet. Do not forget to wear the amulet. I remembered the horror I had when I walked in to witness her commit this sin. A necklace bound with prayers to God and Jesus twisted into witchery, hidden inside a locket marked with the cross and sealed on one side with black and red wax. Bidenech am di fin. It will protect you. Her words were soft, gentle, and I warned her that I couldn't accept it. Yet with a single look, I was helpless. It may have dabbled in witchery and papism, yet it reminded me of her. My fingers rested on top of it. The early death of Thomason, my wife, and making me swear to God that I'd care for Eleanor and Virginia, promising to protect them both. I remembered her dying with those large gray eyes staring up at me during childbirth. A stillborn after Eleanor. Rinda gauridi govaloch amelenor a Virginia. I love you. Take care of Eleanor and Virginia, she told me, in the language I desperately tried to get her to stop speaking. Our journey was filled with peril. It was a dangerous journey of the voyage over to the New World. Her being pregnant, it was dangerous, yet staying at home even more so. The risk of being branded a papist against the crown was too great. Raleigh kindly gave me this chance to redeem myself. Whispers I never listened to circled inside my mind. Her blood was tainted, already Welsh and foreign. She was accused of witchcraft, and thus, leaving was our only option. Those gray eyes, the same physical trait passed down to Eleanor and Virginia. Wearily, I saw the sun shining through and knew God had allowed us to live through the night. There were whispers among the men of feelings of being watched from the shadows, the warmth of campfire keeping whatever lurked away. I silenced them, perhaps too harshly, although my fears guided me. An endless feeling of an unsettled unease made us feel unwelcome. It only grew steadily worse as night crept forward, the occasional call of ravens in the background. There was no sign of Ananias, my son-in-law, and knowing he was a good, God-fearing man, my concerns were with my daughter and granddaughter. I sent out scouts to meet with each of the local tribes nearby, the native population close by, and despite tense relations, I hoped they wouldn't deprive us of news. Despite many tensions between us, I hoped they would be willing to hear us. We were whispering between ourselves whether this was the best option. However, true choice was denied to us. I was to meet them at the border. Jack warned me it was dangerous to put myself in a position of an ambush. He wasn't wrong. The terrain was not in our favor, and losing me would cause the men to lose faith. However, the risk was necessary. Still, combat had never been my strongest ability, and I had never been warlike by nature. They approached us from a cliff. The tree line and other foliage offered them protection while we were in the center, with no cover if the meeting went sour. We were also armed solely with cutting swords, rapiers, and with 2 muskets. We hardly posed a threat. It was barely enough to defend ourselves. The weather was harsh, and your people's crops kept failing. We heard rumors of a warband led by Wanchis attacking our settlement. Manteo warned us with a shrug, I could be mistaken. Many have gone elsewhere. We gasped, looking among ourselves, and he raised his hand. Some of your number came to live amongst us, and my mother granted them a sanctuary. Others went to another, and nor do they have any desire to return to your people. His tone suggested he wouldn't permit any forced encouragement for them to return back home. And some. He let out an involuntary shiver, and few things, I believed, would worry him. Yes, anywhere else? I inquired. The distance between us gave an impersonal feeling. He hesitated to answer. The one who walked, a spirit who will not rest. He gestured with a palm upward, gestured out to the tree line where we saw no one standing there. Our shamans do not know how to deal with it. He shuddered, the life drained from his face. It was not the first time we had heard of their superstitions. Who is this spirit? I asked. Surely it had to be a pretender, someone who wished to steal them away for themselves. One who walks in the mist, whispers, drains us, and watches from outside, Manteo answered. Looking at his face, I saw the signs of disease. Smallpox that he had managed to survive, whilst others among his people perished. This was no time to listen. Do you know where my daughter is? My granddaughter. I need to find them. A chill entered the air. The birds fell silent, and the chief with his men all turned to look at each other. While we didn't understand, we knew that a devil was now among us. A feeling of an approaching terror gripped me. A lingering fear, and a figure of a woman appeared by the side. She was garbed in a funerary shroud, clad with barely enough to maintain her modesty. Thomas, one of the youths, raised a musket in the direction of it and fired when I realized. Thomason, I whispered, as it was not her who stared back at me. Around her waist was a belt. Dangling from it were the long-haired skulls of a settler, her face a dried husk, and another with the head of one of the native people. The settler's skull was thrown at my feet, the face too rotten for me to decipher who it was, and the native's was equally returned to them. It was picked up by one of the warriors. I couldn't understand what the significance was, but how could my beloved Thomason do this? Manteo, the chief, gazed at me with wide-eyed horror, fists clenched in assumed betrayal, and his people whispered among themselves. You know her. She was my wife. My air was taken out of me, unable to comprehend what she was. I knew. Was I wrong? I saw her in her burial shroud. I have buried her myself. She would never do this. My words faint, barely coming from my lips. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, the shroud stained with corpse blood and dirt from crawling out. Those pale gray eyes gazed out, unblinking, and she pointed a finger out. Steadily, it moved until it rested on a place near the shoreline, lingering there, and she faded away. Confused about her meaning, I ran toward her, only for my men to hold me back and pull me back, lest to be dragged wherever she lay in wait. Thomason, please, speak to me. I implore you. She turned back to me, whispered 2 words I couldn't understand, and finally disappeared. There was nothing more to say to Manteo or the Croatan. I gazed at his face for a moment, troubled, and watched while the settler's head was lifted from the ground, wrapped in a jacket, and we prepared to make our farewells. An uncertain farewell was granted, and I was no closer to discovering the truth. God be with you, I said. Then Manteo's lips lifted, barely a smile, and his brow line was narrowed. Concern marked his face, and I heard his people's whispers around him. He waved before we left to go our separate ways, and my thoughts were many. My wife was dead, yet she walked, and had unholy powers far beyond possible for a human. I ignored my second-in-command's question while we made our way back. The world no longer made sense. Perhaps this was purgatory, too unholy to make it to heaven, while not wicked enough to be thrown in hell. The trudge back to the settlement left us with more questions than answers. I don't know what caused her to become like this, what wicked witchcraft or devilry had possessed her. She was a virtuous woman and buried in a Christian cemetery following the proper rites. We organized to meet with the other colonists, preparing expeditions to travel out to reach the different tribes. It was risky, splitting up our forces in potentially dangerous territories, only for them too to disappear. There was no trace of them found. Strange, none of them wished to return. Some having settled with natives, and even desired a family. We asked them if they were being threatened to stay, but no, they insisted. My daughter and granddaughter were both still missing. I walked out to the cemetery and the graves were overgrown. There was no signs of disturbed soil nor hastily dug up graves, with few, if any, gravestones and only wooden crosses. Though memory, I easily found my way to Thomason's grave. It looked as I remembered it. Using my hand, I wiped the debris off it. Then I knelt on the grave and felt no design it was disturbed. What had taken hold of her? Thomason, please. I wept, imagining her delicate hand reaching upward to stroke my face, only to receive nothing in response. I made my way back to the makeshift encampment. I received a note coupled with locks from their curled, colored hair. My hand trembled whilst I brought it to my lips. I smelled violets and other flowers. Closing my eyes, I dreaded the news and broke the red seal. It read, John White, ye are to come alone at night to the beach of the grove. Bring none, lest mother and child will die by your doing. It was her handwriting. I had to resist the urge to kiss the paper in loving memory, despite the threatening message. At least they were alive. No one saw who had delivered the note, and I was recommended to be cautious. Yet, I agreed, leaving the men as I went out into the dark alone with a solitary torch toward the grove. The ocean waves crashed steadily, the sky completely obstructed by dark clouds, and I saw her. The wind was increasing, and I feared that my source of light would extinguish. I walked out to the grove, where scared symbols lay from before the native population danced in the breeze. I struggled to step through the sand, my shoes twisting, and her back faced me. I wished it was my wife, and hoped it would be her, rather than a strange being that held control, keeping her under its spell. I stepped on an ornate clay pot by accident, breaking it, and I heard whispers in voices and accents I didn't recognize. Chilling fingertips trailed along my skin, my hands, and the back of my neck. I spun on the spot, trying to catch a glimpse of them, and they weren't there. I didn't belong here. Where is Eleanor and Virginia? I beseech you, tell me. Go home, John, or else I will find your kinswoman. The voice in the fog warned me, gentle, loving, and I nearly forgot what she was. And those ever so familiar gray eyes stared back at me, a trace of humanity, and I dropped fearfully to my knees. What? I can't leave this land. She gave me a lingering, knowing smile, and I suspected my daughter had already met her end. When she turned, all I recognized from her were those eyes I gazed into. Eleanor was kneeling, her clothing coated in filth and brushes. Her cheeks were sunken in, but otherwise looked to be unharmed. Sleeping, her eyes closed and oddly peaceful, her hair tilted her head upward, and exposed that pale throat. "I warned you to come alone." A bone knife struck across her throat. A burst of blood followed by a thick trickle. "No!" I screamed. She roughly pushed her body toward me, and I tried to close the wound. I knew it was foolish. Her eyes opened and closed with a whispered word lost to me. I stared up at her, desperate and hoping to understand. "Why would you do this? Why would you promise only to take her away from me?" "I promised no such thing." Her polite response answered me, with no hint of taunting me. She raised an eyebrow. Her hand moved, causing the cowl to move, and I saw a babe in her arms. She, too, was sleeping, just like her mother had been. Her flesh was pink, amber-colored. Curls circled around her head, wrapped in a swaddle, and she was alive. A toddler, perhaps able to walk, yet would she have any memory of me, of her parents? Seeing how old she was made me realize how much time had truly passed. "Your price has been paid." I released Eleanor's body, allowing it to roll on the ground only, and swore when I heard it begin to sizzle, her skin cooking, then disintegrated before me, sinking into the earth, becoming one with it. Foolishly, I reached out to grasp her, trying to hold her only for the meat to twist and boil in my hands. I screamed, wiping them on my trousers and peering down at the deep boils on my palm. She stood, holding the babe, and reminded me of a dread Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus in her arms. "Os na noch vi, ehenidiai, sizizofi." If you don't, their souls are mine. Her words were cold, deadly and dangerous, never blinking. The threat was there, and I couldn't risk her immortal soul without trying to rid her of whatever wore her face. "Please, at least let me take little Virginia. Please." I pleaded with her, my arms reaching out to take the baby, staring at the babe nestled in her ghostly arm, unaware the danger both her body and soul were in, and knowing her grim fate. Virginia opened her eyes, pure innocence. Briefly, her eyes took on a look of acknowledgement, and I waited, hopeful, only to have it snatched away. "I will take her to those born of the land. You will never see her again. Both your punishment and your reward." She growled at me, ignoring my sob and knowing it was a dangerous bargain. One hand tilted the babe's head upward, exposing the soft and ever so tender flesh. "And she will grow safe and happy." Her words soft, yet unyielding once more. Her hand reached out to mine, and mine to hers. For a second, she resembled the loving woman, the God-fearing woman who was my wife, my beloved. I opened my mouth to answer, to barter for better terms, when I heard people calling my name behind me. Ghosts and shadows of people long since dead. And thus, she disappeared, ignoring my screams, and I was alone. My family gone. I cannot recall how long I lingered out in those woods, and I don't think I left that spot. Wolves, bears, and untold predators who I thought would ease my suffering would look at me, sniffed me even, and decided I, too, was too unworthy to consume. I knew I could hear my men call out to me. My men found me, brought me back, and for a time I refused to talk. No words could convey my trip. Why would God taunt me like this? Finally, I was found, and for a time, I was unable to speak. I left. I sent a letter to Richard Hakluyt, a friend and holy man. To the merciful help of the Almighty, whom I most humbly beseech to help and comfort them. My part in the tale of Roanoke was over. The voyage to return home was a blur. England no longer felt like home, and hadn't for a considerable amount of time. So instead, I went to Ireland to reside in Raleigh's estate and spend much of my fortune trying to find news of them. It didn't reduce me to penury or homelessness, yet it reduced my funds to worrying levels. Aiming to bring some measure of delight back to my life, I'd paint using memory of them, and their facial features would fade. It showed on the paintings, and all that remained were the memories of those gray eyes, a trait I both loved and loathed. Unlawful people would scam me. I heard rumors of Eleanor writing on a stone that had been lost, warning us that an attack had come from the Native Americans, that there was the promise of gold to whomever would show it to me. Other than that, there weren't any rumors about where she had went. Lies. They were all lies, sent by men who wished to claim my coin, that I happily handed over to maintain the illusion that she was alive. Not physically. I can only hope wherever she went, she was happy. I'd protect my amulet, thinking of them, praying they would be safe, and she would keep her promise. Helpless, I had to trust her. I'd hold it, thinking of her and wishing to keep her memory alive. If I set foot again in America, she and her children's children would suffer, and thus I will remain in Ireland. Nothing had been heard concerning Virginia. I've heard from people in the Doeg, the Tuscarora, and the Hatteras, have grey eyes and can speak Welsh. Perhaps they are my descendants, her descendants. Maybe she had survived. All I can hope was in the end, she was happy.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you